My name is Aston Bafaldua. I am coming to you from my ancestral lands of the Carizo Comicrudo tribe, or Eshtokna, which in English means of the human people. I would like to read you this quote, and because my story in this group is a very, very different one, because you will hear other stories of heritage and knowing their heritage and having their history. But I come from an area called the Rio Grande Valley on the U.S. Mexico border, where all our history was wiped out by the Spanish, by the Texans, and by the United States government. And so I'll read you this. This land was Mexican once, was Indian always, and is, and will be again. That was written by Gloria E. Antaldua, who's one of the most prolific writers of our region. It comes from her book, Borderlands, La Frontera, The New Mestiza. And Antaldua is where I start understanding who I am, because Antaldua was this little chicanita queer woman who, gave us language about being queer and being indigenous and being who we are. Because before we didn't know, because the way things were done here was we were once, taken over by the Spanish government, then Mexicans. Then after the Mexican-American War, our land was annexed in 1848 into the United States. And so, unlike every other cavalry, the cavalry in Texas, with the accompaniment of the Texas Rangers, worked aggressively to eradicate indigenous peoples and history. So my people, the Carizo Comicrudo, chose to go underground, to become Mexican rather than go to boarding schools or rather than die. But prior to that, it was the missions. The missions were where they took us at the beginning. The Spanish took us to San Antonio, other places, gave us new names, and said, your name is now Juan, and that is your name. And so growing up, I didn't have any of the verbiage about who I was, because my mother had grown up in Utah, had been raised in a predominantly white community as a Mormon. So I'm also an ex-Mormon. And my grandmother, her mother, really didn't talk about her upbringing, and it's totally different than mine, because she grew up in a more upper middle class family than, say, myself. And then my grandfather, he is from southern Mexico. He was born in Baja California, and we lived in what is the state of Nayarit in southern Mexico. So I have that southern Mexican heritage. The only thing I knew growing up about being indigenous was that my grandfather's late mother, who was alive when I was a child and died fairly recently, was Native. Native, we don't know, because her mother died when she was a child, and her father was from Spain and went blind in his early age. So her tia took care of her on her father's side. So, I remember growing up, my paternal grandmother saying, yeah, my grandfather was an Indian. And I didn't exactly know what that meant. It wasn't until picking up Borderlands that I know that I was a part of a people who had to assimilate into not just being Americans, not just being Mexicans, but being an entirely different people, because our identity would never line up with the rest of the world. My area is 95% Latinx or Mexican American. Many of our people have lived here since the Spanish land grants of the 17th century. But you will never know the difference between them being from here or Mexico, because we're a border culture. So we live side by side in our Mexican heritage, because we're right near the border, the Rio Grande, which my people, the Carizo, believe that's where all life started, in the Rio Grande. We call that a matome, or spirit river. And our relatives went from the canyons up in West Texas all the way to Monterrey, Mexico. And so we lost contact with our northern relatives in northern Mexico. but luckily we do have some members and are currently located in Floresville, Texas, which is near San Antonio. And yeah, so and it's also, even more of a difficult upbringing because, I had to throw away the baggage of being Mormon, being raised in a faith that said my skin color was the product of sin and a curse. My people were ancient Israelites who disobeyed God, so our skin was turned brown. Something I'm still deconstructing because it was never addressed as racist when I was little. It was just how it was. And so, we're now as I'm older, I have been working harder to learn about these things. It wasn't until I became a Unitarian Universalist. Anyways, yes, so I've just been given the signal that I need to wrap up. So I'm going to wrap
No,
up.
that's not the signal. I was telling you had 9 more minutes. So you were
Okay.
saying as you became a Unitarian Universalist.
Okay, yes, as I became a Unitarian Universalist, I really started embracing indigeneity. The way I became a UU was quite interesting. I walked into my philosophy professor's office. She was a logician trained at BC, Boston College. And I told her I was looking for a religion that wasn't too preachy, that would let me believe what I wanted. And she said, "You're talking about Unitarian Universalism." And she said, "Yeah, there's a fellowship here in a place in San Juan, Texas, which I am a member of Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Hidalgo County, which was a byproduct of the fellowship movement. Our church was founded in a room in a house by academics in 1958. So we're still true to the core, fellowship Unitarians, to the point we're lay led. We're not like religious, like the mention of God in my community is like a no-no, because that's how atheistic we are. And so it was hard to reconcile a lot of these beliefs because one, I wasn't a theist. I am not a theist. I identify myself as a religious naturalist or a non-theistic pagan. And so it's been a struggle to understand, can I still be native and not believe in the supernatural, not believe in creator or creators? And, I still think I can be. And I know I can be because it's not about, my spirituality that makes me native. It's not about my language. It's about where I was born and the blood within my veins that is native. So, I view being native sort of like the way that our Jewish relatives are, who, they are an ethnic community as well as their ethnicity is tied with their spirituality. So I think the natural progression of our people, many natives still believe they're native, will still say our prayers and do our ceremonies, but to us, they're the symbols and a part of our culture. They're not, we don't literally believe that, we're going to bring the rain. But if we rain dance or we sing our rain songs in the summertime, we're practicing things that gave our people hope and gave our people the nourishment they needed. And so I have been reconciling and rebuilding that for the last give or take 6 years that 5-6 years I've been in this space. And I've come to realize that to walk the red road, as is a cliche that some say from the Lakota Nation, it's not an easy road, but it's my red road. And my red road, can be narrow, it can be wide, it can be horizontal, it can be vertical, but it's mine. And so if my red road is me practicing neo-pagan traditions and casting circles and identifying as a naturalist or a religious naturalist and not embodying or engendering theism, then so be it. That's my red road. And I'm going to continue walking that as long as I'm alive, as long as I can keep living this way. Because every day I wake up, I look in the mirror and I say, I'm the one they did not kill. I'm the Indian that they could not kill. My relatives, went through so much, losing their language, coming to a new country, and having to change overnight so they could be in this mold. But I'll never be in this mold. I'm from the border. I'm a border person. So if I move to California, if I move to Chicago, or I move all the way to like England, I will still be from the border because that is my culture. That is my history. I will still be both Mexican, American, indigenous, all in one, because that is not something I can ever separate. Land cannot separate me. Time cannot separate me, because that is who I am. And that's who my people have become. So, I would hope one day some of you could come to the Valley and experience the most biodiverse region in the United States, and experience our culture and who we are as people, and just learn more, because our region has been at the forefront of the family separation movement, asylum seekers. We're at the forefront of the border militarization. I grew up in a militarized environment, and as a person of faith and a person of indigenous heritage, and as a person who wishes to undo capitalism and to make a better world, I can tell you that a part of my experience is learning that borders don't define me. The region that I'm from is on Turtle Island. The real immigrants are the people who came in their boats, sailed up the Rio Grande, and found my people. They're the real immigrants, not me. I may look brown, I may be indigenous, but that's no matter where I'm at, this is my home. This is my land. This is where my people are from. You cannot take that away from me. It's not possible. The only way you could take that away from me is, by ending me in some way. But hopefully that never happens. But that's truly what it is. We have to reconstruct and deconstruct who we are. And I hope in this panels that we will do in the coming future, you will see what it is like to be a 21st century native, and what that means in different perspectives, because mine is one of many. Kia's and Sam's are one of many, and we don't all agree. We'll never all agree. But one thing we can agree on is we are people of the earth, and sharing these stories is our duty to our ancestors and our duty to the world. Thank you.
Well, thank you for those words, Aspen and Alan. I'm just really so touched with what I've heard, and I'd like to say too, for myself, I want to also acknowledge that, as you can see, I am a screenshot, right? You're seeing a picture, so I'm joining on a flip phone through dial-in, an old school phone call, and I love everything about that. I love that in these spaces we can create accessibility like that, so that you don't have to have a fancy phone. You can call an old-fashioned phone call, and it's fine. So I want to acknowledge that. And I'll begin my sharing by saying, I was born in Sacramento, and so in other words, urban Indian setting, right? Native experience living in the city, a big city. And much of my family was in Sacramento, all throughout, east, west, north, south. And the way that we got there is, my great grandma, she started out in Colorado, and her first husband was killed, so she remarried and came out here. She came out to Sacramento, to California from Colorado. And in that process, as we've heard other relatives say, I'm just kind of blown away by some of the similarities. My great grandmother, my maternal great grandmother, she had instructions for her siblings, or for her children, excuse me, and So my grandmother's generation grew up with instructions that you don't worry about what tribal language I'm speaking. Speak English. That's what they want you to speak. And she said, and if they ask what you are, you tell them you're American. It's the truth. And that always stuck with me, hearing these family stories, and you go through life as a native in the urban setting, so many questions I think rolling through, and like, wow, I thought those instructions were meant so that we could survive, because it wasn't okay to be Indian. The other story I remember hearing is before she moved to California, there were signs and windows, and maybe even on the journey on the way to California, and these signs read things like no Indian, or no dogs would come first, no dogs and no Indians allowed in the store. So, talk about communicating a subjugated status, a status of, you can't bring your dogs in here, and the Indians aren't allowed in here either. So I'm hearing these stories as I'm growing up, and going, wow, and then that came from my grandmother's generation and continued, it seems to me, into my mother's generation, where she would say, I'm American. And I would hear her later say, I'm Native American or American Indian. But this the training, right? The training of survival. We do not say we're Indian. You do not say you're Native American when you're out in public. And to know you're in an environment where that's being done for your safety. You're not safe if you say what you are. And I remember also my grandmother, she loved to, I'm the firstborn grandchild, so that's a special designation, but she's one of my favorite members of the family. She's passed now, but she would just drill into me every conversation. Before we'd end it, somewhere in the conversation, she made sure she put in, you can pray to God anywhere. It does not need to be in a building. You can pray to the Creator anywhere. So I would say, yes, Grandma. And she'd say, I want to know that you remember that. Yes, Grandma, I remember that. So growing up with these native teachings, but they weren't, like, that was one example where that wasn't explicitly expressed as this is from our tribe. I am teaching you this from our people. And even coming down to my mother's generation, my mother instructed me on the importance of being kind to animals. Plants could help you heal. And I remember her teaching me when I hit puberty about makeup, that this is not a way for us, that this is, you only use it on special occasions, and it should not be visible on your face. People should see your features when you're wearing makeup, not the makeup colors. So this is the tribal values being taught, but very coded, not as this is what our tribe is taught. This is from our people. I remember asking my mom one time too, what tribe are we? And she didn't know. She said, well, maybe we're Paiute. I don't know. It wasn't until my grandma was on her deathbed that I learned that we are Ute. So just to give you an idea of an experience where, as an urban Indian, when a family does things for survival, and then things are coded, or we're not able to talk about who we are, how that can even translate down generations into not knowing what tribe you are. And I'm not sure why my grandma didn't tell everyone until her deathbed, but I was grateful that she told me. And the only other thing I want to add into this before I close, or as I'm closing, is that the urban Indian experience is not one you hear much. So I love stories like Home to Medicine Mountain that show how our ceremonies are, right, for different tribes. And we'll put in the chat as well, Mel and the Blue Arrow. That is an urban Indian story. And we don't hear much of those, because our ceremonies, as Aspen said, we have different perspectives. And the ceremonial life that I come from, and the ways that I know, they're real. It's not symbolic for me. If we're doing a ceremony to heal the land and heal the people, it's doing what we came to do, because that is the power of the medicine. That is the way. So I just want to share that in my closing and say aho. And
Nakute nakute takaman, or long, long ago, therefore it is so. Achai taha em chani avo, inepo kia tayak, inepo San Diego po hoak. My name is Kia. I live in San Diego. In community with other Yoemi, I am learning and reclaiming Yoemi, the language of the Yoemi nation, also known as Yaqui. And in order for me to strengthen my understanding and connection to this part of my culture, and to decolonize not only how non-Indigenous folk view me, but also how I present myself, I'm trying to get into the habit of using the phrases and the words that I have learned. Nakute Nakute Takaman is a traditional storytelling opening that comes from my Tigwa culture. Many years ago, I was able to begin to learn and reclaim some of the Southern Tiwa language as another part of my identity. I am the granddaughter of Juan Crisostomo Renteria of the Tigwa people of Isleta del Sur, of Maria Teresa Baca, whose nation has been lost to colonization, of the Monteverdes of the Yoemi Yaqui people, and of the Mayers of Germany. I'm also the mother of 4 adult children, Elizabeth, Sarah, Julia, and Ryle. Nakute Nakute Takaman, or long, long ago, therefore it is so. Remember the sky that you were born under. Know each of the stars' stories. The children of a family, the siblings and the cousins, that youngest generation, were outside playing, and the mothers and the aunts and the grandmother were sitting nearby working on various chores, and they were talking and laughing as they worked. And one of the young grandchildren ran up and asked the grandmother, "Well, what does that word mean that you just said?" "Hush, it is gibberish. Habla español." The grandmother waved off the curious child, who shrugged and went back to playing. The women in the family had been speaking to each other in the language of their mothers and their grandmothers. But this grandmother made the heartbreaking decision not to share this language with her grandchildren. She insisted to them, "Nosotros somos mexicanos, no indias." How does obsidian forget the hiss of magma? How does water forget the cloud of its birth? Nakute Nakute Takaman, now maybe 50 years later, so not as long ago. Remember the sun's birth at dawn? That is the strongest point of time. Now, one of the grandmother's grandchildren had grown up and was herself a grandmother, and she told that story to her grandchildren of how her generation had been forced to speak Spanish and not understand or learn the language that the adults were speaking. Can wild iris forget the dark belly of the bulb? Does a scar forget the torn raw edge of flesh? Remember sundown and the giving away to night. Nakute Nakute Takaman. Now it's another 20 years, so again, not that long ago. Remember your birth, how your mother struggled to give you form and breath. You are evidence of her life and her mother's and hers. My grandmother, who had been taught to speak Spanish instead of the language of our people, became a ancestor. And this grandchild learned that our great-great-grandmother had left the homeland of our people and moved our family to a town where they weren't known, where they could be Mexican, not Indian, and where her grandchildren would be safe from the residential schools. Hands that reached deep inside chaos brought me out into the world. Mouth that breathed into mine a language wild enough to wake me. Nakute, nakute takaman. Maybe it's now, or maybe sometime in the future. Which of us can tell, because time is not linear. Remember the earth whose skin you are. Remember the plants, trees, animal life. Remember the wind. Remember her voice. And as the granddaughter of these grandmothers whose stories and choices and sacrifice allow me to be here today to tell my stories and their stories, remember you are all people and all people are you. Remember you are this universe and the universe is you. Remember all is in motion, is growing, is you. I honor my grandmothers with my work to help birth a new world into being, a world where no grandmothers have to choose between their homelands, their languages, their cultures, and their faiths to ensure that they have grandchildren and have a chance to have great-grandchildren. When does fire forget lightning? Should canyon forget river? Might skin renounce fingerprint? Will honey deny the bee? Remember that language comes from this. Remember the dance language is that life is. Remember. Don't ask me to forget. Don't tell me this is over. Beneath sand and broken mountains, even the Mojave remembers salt of a fickle sea. So these are some of the stories of my grandparents, and I'm a storyteller. It's part of my Indigenous identity. And when we end a story with the Tigwas, we say Kakweksi, meaning you have a tale. And it's so important to me, and as you've heard all of our stories, but that we can reclaim and learn our languages, that we can share these stories, that we can understand how much so many of our ancestors went through and the decisions, that really painful choices, because that grandmother decided to disconnect from the culture so that they could pass as something other than Indians and not get taken to the residential schools. Yes, they lived and had children and had grandchildren and great-grandchildren, but we don't have that connection. I only learned the name of my great-grandmother's people when my grandmother died and I saw her birth certificate, because her whole life, my whole life, the story had been that she was from El Paso, which is very close to where my Tigwa grandfather's people and reservation are. But they weren't Tigwa, they were Mexican. And it was upon seeing her death certificate and where she was born that I was able to research and realize that she had come from an entirely different community that we have no connection to. So we thank you for the first part of our conversation, which was listening to the stories of our co-facilitators and our guests. Question that's in the chat about what are our relationships with our ancestral tribes. So I want to remind us that what we are doing, these are unlearning conversations. So what you've heard a lot from what Alan was just saying, that there's this division, this pitting Indigenous people against Indigenous people. Whether it comes to, do you know the language? Do you live on a reservation? Do you this, that, or the other? What are your relationships to your ancestral tribes? And so I'm gonna do a little unlearning here before. And so first, like we as 21st century urban Indians, because every one of us, lives in an urban environment, we have to do a lot of work on not judging each other by these colonial standards, because these were not Indigenous standards or modalities of like, well, how many relatives and how many grandparents do you have, and did you live there, did you travel every year and live on that in the spring camp? Because if you didn't, you're no longer Indian, right? Alan's story. And so it is a very colonial question to say, what are your relationships first? And the use of ancestral. So like, we're all living, breathing people whose grandparents were living, breathing people. This is not a long, long ago story. This is a now. And I'm going to invite my co-facilitators and our guests to think about how we want to answer that question or not answer that question. Because answering that question in a certain way is falling into the colonial, well, I have to give you my credentials and I have to tell you my blood quantum and I have to tell you my connection. At the same point, as Aspen has said, and is why we're doing what we're doing, is to share these stories and to educate. So for me, this is one of those moments of really having to do some discernment and some thought of how much is sharing and educating and building community, and how much is checking off some boxes to fill those quotas, to make it acceptable that we are the people talking about these things, right? So if we're talking about that question, and I'm not saying, Pat, that you're asking that question in that way, but if we're saying that the Indigenous people today are answering that question in the spirit of, are we Indigenous enough to be leading conversations? Are we Indigenous enough? Do we have deep enough relationships? I'm going to say we're not going to answer your question in that spirit, because that's the unlearning for today. Is like that the unlearning next part would be to ask you all not to ask that question again, right? Like the same of, well, where do you really come from? It's along those lines. And if we're learning as Unitarian Universalists and non to do anti-oppressive and anti-racist ways of being in relationship and asking questions, that's along those lines. And because we are a community here, each of my relatives gets to answer that question and address it where they're at today. So I do see Aspen's ready to address it.
So to address that, it's a double-edged, sword for me, because unlike my other facilitators, their relatives are in what we now know as the United States for the most part. But my relatives are on my grandfather's side, are from southern Mexico. So this is an entirely different culture. And the thing is that I am probably mixed with far more south of the border natives, if we're going to use those terms, than on this side of Turtle Island. And the problem that arises with us who are of Latin American descent, who have relatives that come from that area, is that we instinctively know, like 99% of all Mexicans are natives. To what degree we know what native, we don't, because thanks to the supremacy of the Mexica Azteca people prior to the arrival of the Spanish, there were many different tribes, but the Mexica acted as imperialists and assimilated other people into their way. And so, for instance, like all Mexican indigenous languages are Nahuatl or a Nahuatl language. So, but the particular people from where my grandfather comes from would be the Mixteco people, would be the Chichimeca and all those people. But thanks to Mexica supremacy and the co-opting of the Chicano movement, my people and other people who may have been raised in these traditions do not get to identify themselves this way, because everyone is just Aztec, and that's not the case. There are many nations, like the farther south you go, like on the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, all of that is Mayan land as you get into Guatemala, and they speak entirely two different dialects. They speak Cochi and they speak Mam. So, like, let's say you go to Guatemala. Guatemala is an interesting place because I had a friend who went there. Guatemalans do not primarily speak Spanish. The first thing you would ask, like, they'll see me, I'm brown skinned, they'll say, they won't ask me, do you know Spanish? They'll ask me if I know cochi or I know mom. Because everyone there, even though they're Guatemalans, are Mayans. Like, they still practice their Mayan traditions and they still speak their language. So, like in Latin America, 12 million native people still speak their native language as their first language. And that is a big problem that we are facing. But I could go on and on about this because it just, this perspective is not mentioned in North America, in American United States indigenous people, because my people and my relatives are still fighting the colonizer directly in a way that is decimating our culture, our land, and we are still trying to be recognized, because indigenous people in America, they do have a lot more rights in terms of indigenous people in Latin America, because indigenous people in Latin America are not recognized. There is no recognition, and there is no state apparatus saying, well, we're going to try to make it available for you guys to learn your language. We're going to try to make it available, documents in your language. No. If you don't know Spanish, then you're out of luck, because the government does not care. So now I'll invite Sam to speak next.
Sure. I think I'll just be brief. So along the lines of what Kia was sharing too, and thanks, Aspen. I appreciate everything you shared. I really would love to also hear what Alan has to share. What I will say is, when I wake up in the morning and I acknowledge Mother Earth, and I acknowledge my ancestors, and I acknowledge this land, the Kumeyaay, and the land herself, I am honoring my ancestors. I am in relationship with my ancestors. I'm remembering who I am. Even if I don't know my language, I do that with a good heart. And my ancestors see that. And I know, for me, that is part of being Indigenous. And when we think about this, we can think about it as well as, what is the stereotype of Native peoples, right? Because the concept of relationship to your ancestors, does that get defined by somebody outside of you as an Indigenous person, or does that definition come from within you? Who's the right party to do that, so to speak, or how should that be looked at? So we kind of have still these elements that we're going through as part of when we talk about today Indigenous identity and the language connected to Indigenous identity, and these complexities with just Indigenous identity being Native in the United States of America, with tribes where the border crossed the tribe didn't cross the border, like what Aspen's mentioning. So I think we have to open and understand that relationship is not just maybe a few things I can write down on a list, right? It's what we embody. For me, it's the way I live. How am I living the way I was taught? How am I honoring my ancestors? How am I going about my life? I'm supposed to be going about, right, in a way of living life to be a good human being. And I believe that's original instructions in almost any spiritual teaching, no matter what the name of the religion is. Yet with Indigenous people, somehow this gets lost of, it's kind of invisible. Like, are you Native? Are you connected? What is that connection? And all I can say is, for me, it's honoring the way I was taught. And we have this saying, right, in ceremony, that they have this saying that we get reminded of frequently because we don't want to forget. And the saying is, don't play with these ways. Don't play with these ways. Why? Because these ways are real. They're real. The medicine is strong. It is real. The ancestors are real. So we come to ceremony. We know you come in a good way. You conduct yourself in a good way. And you come with that open heart and open mind, and you don't come to, like, say, show off. because that would be playing with the waves, right? You don't come to try to do harm, because that would be playing with the waves, and there are repercussions spiritually for that will manifest physically in your life. So what does it mean to be in relationship then? For me, it's knowing and remembering the protocol, remembering the way that I'm taught, honoring it. And I have to say, in an urban Indian setting, the other thing that has been huge for me is that it's an intertribal world, right? It's not like I'm not going around going, okay, you're not you. I can't associate with you. Oh, Aspen, you're not. Alan, you're not either. I am so happy as an urban Indian to see another native, and we have little things sometimes we wear, right? Or ways we talk, the ways we greet each other that we know, hey, are you native? Just by the way the person is acting or what they're wearing or how they're speaking to me. That, like, yeah, are you native? Yeah, and shake hands, say hello, because it's this recognition, like, okay, I see myself, and I don't get to see that every day. I don't get to see that in the media. Look at the media right now. Look at the dominant anything, the dominant news feed. Go look at the grocery store at the shelves and the magazines, and you're just gonna see Barbie, Ken, and Skipper practically. It's the whole gang, like, that's not a message to me affirming me that the first people of the land. That's the message of white supremacy. That's the message of something that has nothing to do with me. So, what does it mean to be in a relationship? It means for me as an urban Indian, it also means we look for intertribal settings and we come together in unity. We don't trip on what tribe you are, what blood quantum, at least not in the intertribal settings, which sometimes are called multi-tribal settings, that I hang out in. It's not like that. It's very loving and welcoming and affirming of us as tribal people. And I remember one time I was talking to Alan, and he said, like, the urban Indian experience, people forget it is an Indian experience. And he said something like else, like the multi-tribal experience is what kept it keeps our traditions alive. It has kept and still keeps our traditions alive. So like these urban Indian centers, that's where I would hang out when I was in college and sing with the ladies, with my siblings. Um, we just come together like that, and if we get asked to go sing at a powwow, then we go because the people asked us. If we're at a ceremony and you're asked to sing, then you sing. If your gift is singing and the people ask for you to sing for them, you sing for them. That is what is community. That is relationship. So it's so complex. I don't know. For me, it's kind of hard to break this down in a multicultural group because of the complexities of indigenous identity, but hopefully that helps with that question about, what is your relationship with the ancestors. Um, we're many nations, right? But I can go anywhere as a people. For example, before I came down here to go to college, my relatives in Sacramento, we did a ceremony so I could be sent off in a good way. Prior to that, they got the names of Native people at Cal State San Marcos, and they said, these are Indians that are there. You need to go meet these natives. These are their names. These are their phone numbers. They had already talked to them. So, like, our people make way for each other. So when I come down, they're not like, what nation are you? Or, are you they already know I'm coming. And it's like, hi, I'm Sam. Our relations up north where I come from asked me to connect with you. I'm like, okay, let us know whatever you need. If you get confused in this university, you let me know. This is what I do. This is how I can help. And, relative, welcome to the Senyo and Kumeyaay land. Welcome. So that was beautiful. That's our way. So what is relationship? It's when we interact with each other, honoring our ways. It's when I see my relatives on the road one time. It just happened when I was traveling back up to Sacramento, and I see you fighting. Like, hey, what's going on? How are you? Is everything all right? Well, no, we're arguing. The kids want cookies. We don't have enough, and we're just trying to figure out food. I'm like, well, hey, I'm going up to Sacramento. I know it sounds like you're going in a different direction, but I got food in my car. Here, I got a bunch of grocery bags, and I separated it: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Will you help me? We'll pop the hood. What would you like? I got plenty. I'm going to go to my family, and they're going to buy more food. They're going to take me to the grocery store. That's the first thing they're going to do when I show up. So what would you like? And don't be afraid. You take as much as you want, relatives. What were the kids like? I got these cookies. Would they like these cookies? Try these. You want some bread and peanut butter, make sandwiches, like whatever you want, please. I'll get you a bag. Here's an empty bag, fill it up, and tell me if you need, like, here's another one. You know, that's our way. That's relationship. That's honoring our ancestors. So when we ask a question, what is our relationship to our ancestors, our ancestral land? It's the way we are. It's the way we're living. It's the way we're being to each other. And it's how I start my day for me, saying, good morning, Mother Earth, and acknowledging my ancestors, the land. I hope that helps. And Alan, I would love to hear if you would contribute, if you're open to contributing to answering this question about what is our relationship to our ancestral land.
Connection to ancestral land. Okay,
ancestral tribes. I'm so sorry. What is your? Okay. Let me read it to you. I'm sorry, Alan, to interrupt you. What are your relationships with your ancestral tribe?
I'm gonna take it one step further from you, Sam, because when I got to college, you know, the first kid in my family to go to college, and I bumped everybody, right? I went all the way through and got a freaking doctorate, and I remember giving it to my mom because I didn't want to accept it, and I danced in my regalia because I wanted to be a dancer, but my uncle said no, that's not your way, and I remember crying because they said you have to go on and be a teacher. You're gonna be an educator, and you're gonna go to school, and you're gonna do that, and then you're gonna come back and share all that stuff, and that's what you're gonna do because that's your role, that's your job. And I remember getting really, really, really mad at my uncles for that because I wanted to be a dancer. I wanted to be a powwow dancer, and it was funny because at one point then my mom said, "You're freaking Californian, dude. Powwows aren't even from here. What the hell are you thinking?" Sorry, excuse my language. But you know, sometimes my mom was pretty crass. And you know, I said, well, that's what I want to do. That's, you know, that's where all the cool kids were, right? That's what I wanted to be, and it was something totally different than everybody else. But I didn't even experience or get into any of that until I went to college. And like I said previously, my college experience, the college was bigger than the whole town that I grew up in, and that was the bulk of my life. And that was the first time I saw somebody that was blonde hair and blue eyed, you know, and fair complexion. And it totally bummed me out because I was just like, you know, where is everybody? You know, I had no one that I could connect with. And my mom dropped me off in the corner of my dorm, waved her hand and said, have a good life. Don't write until you find work, you know, and she took off. She threw all my stuff out on the corner and she took off. Later, I had asked her, and she said that was the hardest thing she had to do, but she knew that if she stuck around, I was not going to get on my own 2 feet, and I had to do it. And she wanted to see what was going to happen. But I was there at college, and I bumped into a teacher who said, "Oh, you're that Indian kid." I was like, "How the heck do you know?" And he said, come on. I wanted to go show you something. And he took me to the Indian Tribal Center where the kids were, or all the college kids. And I looked around, and I was like, here you guys are. And it was just like a homecoming. It was like no big deal. It was just like all of a sudden we were there. There was only like a dozen of us, right, in this whole big campus. But it was like all of a sudden there was the community. And then, you know, and then my uncles gave me permission to start learning to sing, and I was like totally into it. And then, you know, my other cousins were dancing, and it was cool for them to do so, right? So I wanted to be a dancer too, right? And I was singing, I was dancing, you know, we were doing all this stuff. And then in between, when you weren't singing and dancing, you had to go take care of the people, and that was your job. And you had to go take the elders their food. You had to go help them with whatever was going on. If they needed a ride, if they needed anything whatsoever, that's what you do. Don't matter day or night. And when I went to college, then I was getting my doctorate. My mom and dad moved back to the res. Well, my mom married later, so I call him my dad, even though he's not biologically my dad, but he's my dad. And they moved back. This is hard. And they needed to have the horses being taken care of. My mom raised horses. That's what she wanted to do. She said they were her big dogs. And she was dying at the time, and I didn't know this. And I had to drive back at least one day a week, if not 2 to 3, to go take care of the horses for my mom and my dad, help them out on the res, or near the res. They were like right on the border. And it conflicted with one of my classes, and it was the only F I ever got in school. And the teacher, I remember, he said, I'm failing you because you don't put up and give up anything that's happening. And I remember, being just torn and devastated that I was getting a failing grade. I felt like I was letting the family down, because they told me, I could not go on with what I wanted to do because that was my job. And I felt like I was letting down my family. And the professor who failed me, I remember staring at him and saying, how dare you, dude? It's like, you're giving me the choice between taking care of my family and taking care of my elders and coming to your damn class. Excuse my language. It's like, I bust my hump to do all the extra work, and I see all of these other kids sitting around drinking espresso and complaining that they don't have enough time in the library. Like, and I'm driving back and forth 3 hours, at least twice a week, riding the horses in the morning before I come to your classes and everything, and you're going to fail me? You're going to make me choose between my family and this education? How dare you? And that was hard. But I remember as my mom was dying, everything that she said about, you take care of the family, you take care of your elders, you respect them. So even though I don't get a chance to pray, even though I don't get a chance to go to ceremony or to those things, like I used to when I was growing up, I had to remember that the way they gave me, that's what I have to do. And that's how I respect them. That's all.
Thank you, Alan, for sharing that really personal and emotional story. And that is also part of the systemic stuff. I've talked at certain UU things when we've there was a regional assembly and we were supposed to do something. We were a little bit late, the group I was working with, and I came in and I said, we're late because it's Indigenous time. And I'm going to tell you what that means, because it's not a joke. Like, we had a member of our team who suffered a loss in the family and learned like 15 minutes before the session was supposed to start. People before process, we needed to be with her and then once we got her in a good spot, then we were going to come and do the work. And y'all were going to wait or not wait, but we weren't going to make her wait. So yeah, I know, Pat, you've been so patient in letting us have this part of the conversation, and we'd like you to talk now.
Well, actually, when I raised my hand, we were talking about language, and I had it. I'm not sure it's appropriate now. I mean, these heartfelt stories that, it seems kind of, I don't know, off the mark somehow. But I was in New Mexico, and this teenage girl was it was part of a program showing us around, and she said, if it weren't for the Indian school, and this just so shocked me, I wouldn't know my language or my ceremonies. And I wanted so badly to say, what? I thought the Indian schools were the opposite. I thought they tried to squelch the language and the ceremonies, but evidently this is a modern thing. And I don't think she was talking about a boarding school either.
Right. I think that's part of there's a difference in language. There's residential schools, and then there are now Indian schools run by the nations, run by the individuals, where they are teaching the languages, the culture, the arts, that kind of stuff. So there is the use of the word. I try to use residential school when talking about that versus Indian schools.
Yeah, I have nothing but horrid negative images at
Yeah.
residential schools. And so when she said that, but I was afraid to ask questions. I don't know why I was exactly afraid. I thought she might feel like I was criticizing something that it was important to her and that she was finding something good from. But I was dying to know, what in the world are you talking about? Because this is, I mean, all these dead children and awful things that happened, and being punished for speaking.
Right.
And,
Yeah,
anyway.
definitely a very different thing was happening, because residential schools were very specifically cutting indigenous youth from their culture, from their language, cutting their hair. They weren't allowed, they were dressed a certain way. There's, a lot of, we know a lot about that. But I think what we don't as a whole know is that a lot of communities are creating Indian schools to teach those things. So it's kind of the, I don't even want to say, but like the antidote to that, right? Is we like the song I played at the beginning was Know Better, Do Better. So we, being able to, and again, there's like so many layers of what does it take for a tribe, a reservation, a group of indigenous folk, what resources to be able to put together a school where they are teaching their community the language and the dances and the all that stuff. And I see Aspen wants to jump in.
Yes. So the thing about Indian schools and the difference between residential schools is, in this country, residential schools did not last as long as they did in Canada. The Canadian government was still forcing Indigenous First Nation people to go to residential schools as early as the early 90s. So the graduates and students of that are probably around the age of, between the ages of 40 and 50 as the youngest. They weren't, by then there was a little more changes, but it's still terrible. But yeah, there are people that, are parents, people that are my age, I'm 22, their parents in the First Nations in Canada went to residential schools, were forced to be there, and they were assaulted and all these other horrible things. And the thing about that is, Indian schools are across the Indian country and our native Hawaiian relatives. We've been pioneering these programs on the res that are solely ours, where we're not asking the BIA or any Indigenous, any like government apparatus for Indigenous folks to teach on our reservations, because res schools have traditionally had white people who were going to come from the res, and they were going to go and stay and live there. They lived on the res as a part of the BIA's education initiatives. But nowadays it's not that way. I mean, there probably are still some who teach there that moved onto the res to teach, especially like in the Navajo Nation. A lot of the overlap, especially with Mormons, a lot of Mormon missionaries were often given, like a professor of mine, her uncle was given property on the Navajo reservation. And so she grew up partially, a white woman grew up partially on the res with the Navajo Nation in Utah. So that is still a common thing. But to address, there is a large difference. And to just touch about on language, we were trying to revitalize. I know, like in South Dakota and North Dakota, the Dakota peoples have managed to get their languages taught in the public schools after years and years of fighting. And the thing is that this is not a popular opinion, but I am in favor for both non-natives and natives learning the language. The part of decolonizing is learning to communicate in a language of the land that you're living in, to know that the land, that you live on had a language prior to you coming here. And I always go back to what my chairman says, we need to remember who we are. because we were all indigenous people once upon a time. But due to the Christianization of Europe, our peoples were forced to become, the Europeans they are today. But all people started out as children of the earth, and hopefully one day we can get back to that, to where tribal affiliation will not just be about your blood or where you're from, but it'll be that we're all human beings. Understand that at one point we all took care of the land.
Now, I'm not saying anything I think that most people on this call already know, but I appreciated so much hearing the honest conversation or sharing of what a struggle it is to unravel one's ancestry given the effects of colonization on relationship. The fact that, well, am I now only half Indian because the colonizers have decided what I am, and I think that's part of what makes it more difficult for me to it's like almost the best way to ask a question is simply to listen, right? And if because the answer is in the answer really was in the story. I'm so grateful. The first time I understood, well, I won't tell a story about my own past, except to say that my mother's generation was not encouraged to learn Swedish. And of course, you can tell by my skin color, we were able to assimilate. We were able to pass very quickly. Yeah, it takes a while to accept the injustice and the privilege that comes with that. And my sisters, I haven't decided to do it, but my sisters have retired. I haven't. They're learning Swedish now. I love them dearly for that. I think that's all I'll say for now. Thank you again, everyone who shared.
Awesome. I do see Michelle's hand up, and before we go to you, Michelle, yeah, when I learned about, so I have a story about my German grandmother we also passed as Catholic instead of Jewish. And when I got to a certain point in my early 20s with this reality that both maternal sides had passed to survive, I had a lot of issues I had to work with because there was a lot of privilege in being able to do that. And so, yeah, definitely an interesting, like a conversation for another day. And Michelle, we'd love to hear from you again.
First, please say thank you to Alan. He got me crying. One, the privilege thing, wow, because isn't it that all of us are bits and pieces of so many, and so many of us pass without knowing, and some of us have like connections, some of us don't. But when we bought our property, when we bought our house and paid it off, I suddenly realized I owned Cherokee land. And that made me so, because it just, wow, I never even, thought of that. But I find it so interesting because I discovered that the Cherokee Nation, the Western Tahlequah, was doing the Cherokee language online, and that's how I started taking it with Ed Fields, and I will be going on and doing more. And he's wonderful because he's one of the elders, and he is one of the native speakers whose parents were both native speakers, and he also tells us stories. He's wonderful. But I find it so interesting that the timing of when so many of the nations are finally getting to the point where they're reclaiming their language, their culture, setting up ways to pass this on to the next generation and ensure that their children and grandchildren are still here and will survive and will remember who they are, and that there are groups that are finally getting together and realizing that blood quantum and however else you're counted is not about who they are, but about what the colonizers put on them to also try to, the United States, this is a way to obliterate groups of people that they signed long-term pacts with and treaties with the intention of putting them on blocks of land and letting them die. And it's like, as soon as like so many of the Iroquois nations are now getting their languages back, even what is it, Fox and Sac, is they found people that still know enough and they're rebuilding that. And yet what comes up at the same time on top of that is another wave to try to take away voting rights, identity rights, and undermine. And I live in Tennessee, and I grew up overseas my entire life because I'm a military brat and I speak other languages. I didn't have part of my roots, and coming back here, it blew me away. I'm gonna get sad too, like, because you don't think who you are, but when I came back here, I knew who I was in that way. And I'm strawberry blonde, white, skinny, blue eyed, well, green eyes. And I'm also related to so many people that walked here and died here and lost his land. And I really appreciate you guys doing this. I've loved hearing all of the stories and hearing about you. And if you don't mind, I'm going to try to invite some friends, or at least let them know, because I have other friends who are part of, different nations, and we're all like, we know each other, but they don't really connect, because the same thing, you can walk downtown Atlanta and no one knows who you are, and yet that land used to be part of theirs, or the same in California and in New York, anywhere here, and South America. So, but thank you so much, you guys, all of you, thank you. And in Cherokee, Wado.
We're so glad you were able to join us, Michelle.
Yes, it's such an amazing conversation that we've been having. And I would like to just point out that in this process, the big takeaway that we should all take away is that the American colonial project, or the colonial project in general, has stripped us all of our cultures, all of our heritage. Some of us were Jewish, some of us were Catholic, some of us were religions that no one's even heard of because they died out. But we had to do that to assimilate. But at one point we all had our ways. Like, we just celebrate St. Patrick's Day. St. Patrick assimilated the Irish into Catholicism. And so we now see our Irish relatives are reclaiming their language and their heritage successfully. And it's, that is the thing that I hope one day we can see. Our Eastern European relatives are also reclaiming their heritage and have been. Our Nordic relatives are doing that. So the indigenous resurgence is upon us, and hopefully that can lead to a new paradigm.
Yeah, and we hope that these conversations, as we go on and invite in other of our relations across Turtle Island, can help to help that resurgence and that renaissance.